I didn't memorize exactly how many years, but there is an overlap. Um, Leibniz, I think, dies in something like 1716, so you can see the overlap was brief. But in any case, Berkeley argued against the materialism associated with John Locke's philosophy. That was even one of my quiz questions for you, because the concern here is that if you're going to argue that there's some sort of material out there, but at the same time you can't see, hear, taste, touch it, etc., it's invisible to any of our senses, we have to hypothesize that it's there. Well, the trouble with the hypothesis that Locke gives us explaining material substance is that it's contradictory. On the one hand, you're saying that it has to be there. On the other hand, there's no way you can tell that it's there. Well, how do you know that it's there? Well, what's causing us to sense things if there isn't something there? Well, the answer Berkeley is going to give is that instead of something material, there's something spiritual. And now, this is a fun topic, because of course, the monad for Leibniz is a spiritual being, a being that is so small that it's not material, it's actually more like a soul. And at the same time, Berkeley is arguing that it's like it's like the mind of God, right? So it's spiritual. So they're trying to get away from the conflict that Locke causes with the idea of material stuff, and at the same time we can't know it, by saying that instead what we can know is these souls, because we're of course soul stuff ourselves, and so there's no conflict between us sensing something soul to soul, basically, and Berkeley is of that same mind. So you can see that even though there's disagreements between them, they're actually very close in agreeing on a lot of other things. In fact, the biggest disagreement they have is over the nature of how small things can be. Because if things are infinitely small, and nonetheless infinitely small things can gather together in order to give us the impression of an object, then the infinitely small must actually have a size. And yet, by the nature of it being infinite, it can't. So you end up with a contradiction in that sense as well. Berkeley argues against Leibniz and says that the smallest things can be has to be still sensible, because as far as Berkeley is concerned, to be is to be perceived. Have to have things that are perceived. In fact, if you're at a cocktail party, the expression that you would associate with George Berkeley is to be perceived. Or another way of doing it, if you want to be even fancier, is esse, which is Latin for to be, is English. The English is percipi, which is to be perceived. So esse is percipi. Is the way Berkeley phrases it, which literally means to be is to be perceived. By the way, one of my favorites is the contemporary Willard Van Orman Quine, who argues that to be is to be the value of a variable, a bound variable. To be is to you see that? To be is to be a value of a bound variable. That would mean that in a logical notation such as this, the variable, and the reason you're only going to use variables, you're not going to actually use a named object, because in contemporary science, objects don't actually exist. Instead, what we have are subatomic particles, right? So officially, as I get it, this is very weird. It's really, this conflict is still there, is that when we talk about matter, we say that matter exists at the atomic level and above. But atoms themselves are made of subatomic particles, which are not matter. Instead, we talk about them as being, electrons, neutrons, protons, quarks, and strings, who knows, right? All theoretical ideas. Not that theoretical, though, because electron microscopes can actually show particles, right? So that's kind of intriguing. But it seems like a total fiction to refuse to accept anything above or below atoms as matter, and matter as atoms and above. That seems like that's a part of the fiction, I suppose. But if we're looking at it from either Berkeley's point of view or from Leibniz's point of view, we don't have objects that are made out of material, as Locke argued. Instead, what we have are souls, collections of souls out there. Now, that sounds really weird, of course, and so let me update the vocabulary a little bit. What do we use today? We don't use souls, we say energy. Right? Instantly you realize, oh, yes, it's all energy in an arrangement. Energy in arrangement creates the appearance of objects to us, right? That's kind of how we think of it at the small. The small things are energy in arrangement. So we don't actually have something like an atom, a physical thing that in some sense is impermeable. Instead, we have energy in an arrangement, and the energy is built on charges, which are not actually things. There's positive and negative charges, and those are associated with the spin of the charge, which, if you can imagine nothing spinning, and depending on the nature of the spin, gives it its charge, etc. Kind of interesting, I suppose. That's where this is all going. Of course, they're back far enough that it hasn't changed the vocabulary at all. With Einstein, of course, we end up with the idea of there being mass and energy, right? And so instead of matter and spirit, today we talk about mass and energy, and we don't think of mass as essentially matter apart from it being energy in some kind of a organization, a relationship, a process. Right? So that's just fun. I like that. So we don't have objects, so instead we use variables, and we use predicate language in order to talk about the nature of things, because what we're considering to be the thing are the characteristics, the processes we associate with that variable in a particular situation. So that's, if we're dealing with logic today, they're talking about the predicates, which are the characteristics of the thing. Okay. So Berkeley argues that you can't get infinitely small because that causes contradictions. Leibniz argues that yes, you can get infinitely small, but it's just a hypothetical, and as soon as we're done our calculations, it goes away. So it's really a very strange argument between the two of them. I think it's the kind of argument that only certain individuals call nerds. Have you heard of that expression? I think it's some kind of candy. I thought that was going to be funny. Okay, I'll never use that ever again. But so nerds get into that kind of argument. You could read this stuff, by the way. I'm sure you will. Um, uh, yes. So, it might ask me to sign in. Oh, no, it went right in. Or is this just the front page? Oh, no, that's good. Gives me the whole thing. So you get into the conflict here. There's lots of different ways of getting into that. So you could look this stuff up and see, thanks to the internet, the kinds of things that were going on between them, the various kinds of letters, what kinds of disagreements they had, all kinds of interesting papers. But again, if you do get into it, remember it's the kind of odd disagreement in mathematics. In fact, every single one of the papers that is involved will get into the formulas, the theme, the calculations, and so on. So if you're familiar with math, feel free. Okay. I should also mention the overlap with Spinoza. In this book, the courtier is Leibniz, and the heretic is, of course, Spinoza, and they did get to meet. In fact, they spent 2 weeks with one another, and so Spinoza definitely had an impact on Leibniz. And the biggest question there concerns the nature of God, because remember, for Spinoza, the nature of God, by definition, had to be everything. And Leibniz was still officially a Catholic. In fact, one of the interesting things about Leibniz was he wanted to try, as a courtier, going to court and trying to resolve problems. He was trying to heal the rift between Protestantism and Catholicism. So one of his goals in life was to get everyone all back together into one church, instead of having that conflict, by explaining why they were being silly over the arguments they were having with one another, which I think we actually could agree with today. A lot of the disagreements were really quite frivolous from a modern perspective. But in any case, he obviously did not succeed in doing that. By the way, the 30 Years' War was a contemporary event associated with all of these folks. And that halved the population of Europe. It was a very serious, deadly thing, a lot of disease, as well as just literal destruction of whole villages and so on. But Leibniz continued to disagree with Spinoza over the idea that God was everything, and that continues to be a problem for philosophers after that, including Hegel, for example. Hegel's conception of God, which we'll discuss when we do Hegel, has a lot of people arguing that he's a Spinozaist, and that's a heretic, so you don't want to go there, especially because Hegel at the time was invited to be the head of the University of Berlin, precisely because he was a moderate. He was a Lutheran, but he was a moderate. And there was liberal and conservative points of view associated with Lutheranism. And he was invited as a president of the university because of his moderation. He could, deal with both sides in Berlin over that kind of problem. But a lot of people did critique him by saying that he was a Spinozaist, even though he denied it. So the problem is you want to accept a certain level of Spinoza's point of view, and yet at the same time you don't want to get in trouble by denying the otherness of God from the creation. You have to, in order to be a Christian officially, you have to believe that God was other than the creation, etc. Right? So how do you do that when at the same time you're trying to adopt an awful lot of what Spinoza does? The other interesting thing, and I didn't really talk about this at all with Spinoza, was that Spinoza's belief, he was a dualist, a mind-body dualist. Remember, Descartes was a mind-body dualist and believed that we had a soul, or a mind, and we had a body. And the two were separate but interconnected. So they have some sort of communication with one another. And remember that Descartes comes up with the idea that the soul is somehow located in the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is the site where the soul interacts with the body. And that resulted in Gilbert Ryle calling it the ghost in the machine and criticizing it and giving you that silly little icon of the homunculus sitting in the driver's seat of the body, in the mind, driving left and right and so on. And then everybody asking, well, what gave the homunculus the idea of what's going on? And you ended up with a little homunculus inside the brain of the homunculus and infinite regression. You just couldn't resolve the dang conflict there. Spinoza is a mind-body dualist, but he says there's no interaction between the two of them. And you're like, okay, so how does that work? Well, it just so happens that there are two different aspects of the world as humans perceive it, or as he calls them, modes. There are two different modes of existence. So the one mode is the mental or spiritual or abstract, and the other mode is the physical. And both are created by God, and all of the universe is all in harmony with itself, and as a result you end up with me thinking to myself, let me raise my right arm. Whoa, it went up. How about that? Just dumb luck. Well, not dumb luck. It's the nature of the universe. My mind is thinking my hand's going up, and it's a dilemma for me though, because if I'm saying, hey, I actually see my hand going up, remember, that can't actually be the case. All I can do is imagine mentally that these events are happening, because I'm not actually seeing the thing in itself, or feeling the thing in itself, etc., etc. So how can that be, right? So that doesn't really seem to resolve the problem either. But how do I interpret Spinoza in saying this? I think what he's essentially trying to do is saying that there's two different modes of the way we talk about our experience. The one mode is when we're thinking about them all as mental events that are related to the way my mind works, and the other mode is the mode that we think of as the scientific physical universe with cause and effect and so on. And in fact, for Spinoza, everything is determined. So it doesn't make sense to even think that things are not determined. So everything is cause and effect related. And so do we actually have free will? Good question. Again, very much from Hobbes. Remember, Spinoza goes back to a lot of reading Hobbes. For Hobbes, the free will or free agency is when our predetermined self wants to do something and we're able to do it. That's my freedom. If I'm in a situation where my predetermined self all wants to do something, but I'm restrained from that, that's when I'm not free. So it's not like free will is some kind of magical moment, a miracle that interrupts the chain of causality. No, you have causality and everything is deterministic, but at the same time, mentally, in the mental mode, I'm certainly my free agent, doing everything on my choice. Right? Makes no other sense to do it. Again, that's, I think, a terrific example of model-dependent realism, or reality, is, well, in the model where I'm a free agent and a mental agent, I'm the one that's making my choices. By the way, I think last class I mentioned the book Determined by Robert Sapolsky, which is the new one that's out. I think I even put it up for you to see. And he's still actively out there arguing about this. What I discovered is that there's a book from 1960 by Hayek called The Constitution of Liberty. So this is 1960, and he describes exactly the kind of arguments that Sapolsky's giving and exactly what's wrong with them from 1960. So that's kind of cool. By the way, if you're trying to check this book out of our library, it's out right now because I have it. I'm on chapter 7. That's where the book is if you're looking for it. So that's fun. Uh-oh, I lost whatever that was. So keep in mind that I'm not saying that I shouldn't have said Isaac Newton is wrong. He's just not completely right. Is that better? He's right only as far as he goes. So he's right within a particular frame or model. Telescopes, light. There's lots of things to talk about in Sir Isaac Newton. However, what else is interesting about Leibniz? Oh, when Leibniz was a courtier and sent by the, I think it was the Duke of Mainz, or the Elector of Mainz, whatever the rank was called. Elector, probably. It was the Duke of Brunswick, but the Elector of Mainz. In any case, he worked for him for a while and went to Paris. And while he was sent to Paris, the main task for him was to present King Louis XIV with a plan for King Louis to attack Egypt. The main goal for this was to make sure that King Louis did not use his beautiful new army. He had a beautiful new army that he even bought white uniforms for. And you can imagine, that out there exercising on the lawn, beautiful green grass, all in their sparkling white uniforms, all lined up and shooting, I don't know what, but he definitely wanted to use it. He wanted to get that army out there shooting at somebody. And the Germans were worried that they were going to be the ones, because they're closest, that they were going to be the ones that would be attacked. And they were, actually, it turned out to be. But the hope was that they could distract Louis from attacking Germany. And so Leibniz brought this plan to attack Egypt. And the neat thing is, once you finished attacking Egypt and you had Egypt under your power, you could build a canal, which I don't think the name Suez was attached to it, because the Suez Canal is called that because the engineer that actually ended up building it was named Suez. Yes? Is that right? But in any case, Leibniz never actually got to see King Louis. He was too low on the totem pole. Well, they didn't have totem poles, but you know what I mean. He was too low in the pecking order for him to actually get an audience and suggest this. They did deliver the plan. He did deliver the plan, and it was put in the royal safe, and it's believed that Napoleon found it and used it, and in fact, of course, attacked Egypt.